Hello and welcome to Local Writers Read for August. Our theme this month is Legacy and Inheritance. For those who are just joining, I am Josh Gauthier and I'm here with my co-organizer Claire Guyton. And we have been running Local Writers Read since its inception. And we are happy to be with you virtually this year. We've been running a virtual season just based on pandemic needs, but we are still able to bring you writings from authors, poets from all over Maine. And so we're happy to be kicking off our new one this month. The series in normal times is sponsored and hosted by Quiet City Books in Lewiston, and is also co-sponsored by the Lewiston Public Library. Definitely check both of them out on social media, their websites, great organizations doing great work for the local arts. I will turn things over to Claire in just a moment to introduce our readers for this evening. But before we kick off, just a quick note that this is part 1 of 2. We'll be back tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock with 3 more readers on this theme. And the theme itself. From the very beginning, Claire and I liked assigning themes and then inviting our readers to really play with the idea of what do these words mean? How do they reflect in storytelling in all sorts of different ways? And so for August, we're looking at legacy and inheritance, the things, the situations, the ideas left to us by families, friends, cultures, but then also the things that we leave behind ourselves. And that can be individuals, it can be large scale things. But we are all telling a story in some fashion with our lives and telling them with each other as well. So we're very excited to have Lynn back with us to read again, and Rebecca joining the series for the very first time. So this will be very exciting, but Claire, take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. We are so glad to be back. Legacy and Inheritance. I am really excited. Okay, so again, welcome to Rebecca Turkewitz, who is new to Local Writers Read. We're so glad to have you. Rebecca will start us off tonight. She's a writer and high school English teacher living in Portland, Maine. Her writing has appeared in the Normal School, Smoke Lawn Quarterly, the Masters Review, Chicago Quarterly Review, the New Yorker's Daily Shouts, and elsewhere. She loves cats, the ocean, and ghost stories, and don't we all? And friend of the series, Lynne Schmidt, is with us tonight as well. Lynne is the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor and mental health professional with a focus in trauma and healing. She's the winner of the 2021 The Poetry Question Chapbook Award and 2020 New Women's Voices Contest. Her chapbooks include Sexy Time, Dead Dog Poems, Gravity, and On Becoming a Role Model. When given the choice, Lynne prefers the company of her cat and dogs to humans. And again, I say, so do we all. Okay, Rebecca, we are ready whenever you are.
Thank you so much. First, I love this series and I'm excited to be a part of it. And on the note of the cat, he might make an appearance. I'll try my best to ignore him if it happens when I'm reading. Yeah, so I'm reading from an essay called In Memoriam. It's on cemeteries and the idea of sort of honoring ordinary lives and a particular stonecutter who lived in Freeport, Maine. And I think it'll become clear how it relates to the theme as I read. All right, so In Memoriam. When my students and I pulled up to the oldest colonial cemetery in Freeport, Maine, the weather was more fitting for telling ghost stories than for historical fieldwork. The ground was shrouded in fog, the tree branches were dark and spidery against the sky, and the air smelled like dead leaves and chimney smoke. I was teaching 10th grade humanities, and the trip was part of a local history unit on analyzing primary sources. My students were armed with clipboards and background information about the study of New England graveyards. They'd also learned about Noah Pratt Jr., a stone carver whose distinctive late 18th century gravestones could be found throughout the cemetery. I spent the past 6 weeks emphasizing basic historical principles I hoped my students would apply to their fieldwork. As they dispersed, I had the impulse to yell, as I always do when they're tackling a new project, remember your training. I love old cemeteries. I'm interested in them as objects of study, but for me, their magic lies in their creepiness and their insistent reminder that death is a part of life, in their overgrown greenery and leaning tombstones, and in their ability to outlast everything, their ability to persist. They're such impractical uses of space. The practices that surround them are some of the few ritualistic traditions to remain an almost universal part of life. Who could not be superstitious, sentimental, and impractical around matters of death? Cemeteries are also extremely useful in the study of history. Gravestone iconography and epitaphs reflect religious, cultural, and aesthetic trends and are telling indicators of a community's ideas about death, mortality, and mourning. Although it's a misconception to think that everyone was given a spot in a cemetery and a headstone, cemeteries provide more information about ordinary people than most historical documents. I wanted to show my students that with enough curiosity and context, they could discover the many secrets that these common, accessible spaces hold. My students had read an article about the 3 headstone symbols most commonly found in early New England burying grounds. Each of these symbols had a period of high popularity before falling out of favor. I find these trends fascinating because they are such clear examples of how folk art and primary source artifacts relate to cultural shifts. The first symbol, which was popular from the earliest colonial settlements through the late 1700s, was the death's head. This grinning winged skull, with its dark round eyes, bared teeth, and sloping textured wings, is undoubtedly the spookiest symbol and my favorite. It served as a reminder of the inevitability of death and the briefness of life, an extension of the medieval memento mori tradition. The epitaphs that accompany death's heads often communicate a macabre message, the gist of which is, you, dear reader, will also die, probably pretty soon. In the cemetery nearest my apartment in Portland, one such epitaph reads, "Reader, life is uncertain. Today, its flowery paths we tread. Tomorrow's numbered with the dead." When the death's head popularity started to decline, the cherub, a childlike angel's face with wings, became an increasingly common design. Found on stones from the mid-1750s through the early 1800s, the cherub is a more optimistic symbol. Epitaphs highlight the soul's ascension to heaven. My students found some of these inscriptions just as morbid as those that accompanied death's heads, as many include sentiments such as, "Here lies, moldering in the dust, the body of." But this emphasis on the disintegration of the body was intended to be uplifting, as it contrasted the fate of the immortal soul. The final symbol, the urn and willow motif, arrived in New England in the 1790s on the tide of neoclassicism's arrival in America. By the mid-1800s, it dominated graveyards. It featured a Greek-style urn under the bending branches of a willow tree. Sorry, I felt my cat. In New England, Unitarianism and Methodism were on the rise, and there was a movement towards celebrating the virtues of rational thought. The writing on these stones emphasized remembering the life of the deceased individual and shifted towards "in memory of" instead of "here lies." In the cemetery near my apartment, an urn and willow epitaph reads, "Lo, where this silent marble weeps, a friend, a husband, and a father sleeps. A far cry from decaying bodies and reminders that you too shall die." Beautiful examples of all 3 motifs can be found in the Old Parish Burying Ground in Freeport. My students were instructed to discern whether the symbols they could find matched what they'd learned. Were the time periods consistent? Were the symbols distributed evenly throughout, or were like symbols grouped with like? I was hoping they'd notice that gravestone design trends arrived late to this rural cemetery, trickling up from urban centers. And as in most other cemeteries in Maine, the cherub never gained the traction that it had further south. And during the uncertain years of the cherub's weak reign, Noah Pratt Jr. moved to town and filled the local burying grounds with his unique designs. As soon as I was confident that my students' most pressing questions had been answered, I made a beeline to a small square area in the cemetery filled with high-shouldered slate stones, where Noah Pratt had left his mark. Noah Jr. was from a family of gravestone carvers. His father, grandfather, and 2 of his brothers were carvers working in Massachusetts, and one of his sons would eventually enter the family business. The Pratts shared a unique and progressive style. Instead of carving skulls or angels, they carved realistic portraits of faces. These faces were simple, with only a few variations to mark the features of or gender of the deceased. Notably, all the Pratts carved the eyes in a distinctive way, which helps to identify their work. The Pratt eyes are almond-shaped and upturned at the edges, so they look as if they're wearing cat-eye makeup. Although a few carvers from cities were also carving portraits, the realistic portrait design was rarely seen in rural areas until well into the 1800s. Noah Jr.'s designs were unusual, and even without a signature, it's not difficult to pick out his handiwork. In preparation for the trip, I'd shown my students images of documents from Noah Pratt's life. A rare sample stone he used to show prospective clients examples of his lettering and portraits. A petition he signed asking the town for a new road, which was indeed built and that I drove on frequently. A record of a town meeting in which he was deemed an official hog reeve, which is was a constable responsible for policing damage done by free-roaming hogs, and the page from the 1790 Freeport census with his signature. We discussed his family's legacy, and I'd asked my students to consider what connotations a realistic portrait might have. I told them to look for context clues. I know much more about Noah Pratt Jr. than I shared with my students. I know he was born in Abington, Massachusetts on July 20th, 1758. I know he married Alice Jenkins in November of 1780 before moving to Maine the following year. I know how many acres he bought when he moved to town, 50, and that he bought the land with a partner. I know he sold his share of the land to the same partner when he returned to Massachusetts in 1791 to take over his father's business. I know that he had at least 8 children who outlived him. I know these things because I'd hungrily read the single article I could find on the Pratt family stone carvers and from an extensive library search of digitized Maine records. I've also considered, for longer than I care to admit, whether it's meaningful that he listed his profession as yeoman when he bought his land in Maine and as stonecutter when he sold the land 10 years later, even though at both times he was a farmer and a stonecutter. Did this signify a change in identity, in confidence, or in how he conceived of himself and his true work? Did it reflect how the town would have seen him as he slowly built his reputation as a skilled carver? I wonder. I also wonder if he ever thought, dreamily, of the astounding longevity of his work. He must have known that even the low-quality slate he used would withstand the wear of time and weather for many generations after his death. Did he think with pride that centuries later people would observe his craft and admire the uniqueness of his style or the curve of his lines? I find it hard to imagine that someone who spent his life so intimately involved with gravestones could avoid dwelling on our desire to be remembered and to mark our short lives with something semi-permanent. I hope he marveled at how much of his work he was leaving behind. I hope he at least occasionally allowed himself to romanticize his craft. But I'm revealing more about my cultural inheritance than his. Gravestone inscriptions now commonly focus on 2 central ideas, memory and love. That day in the burying ground, I didn't try to explain to my students my fascination with Noah Pratt Jr.'s life or my enchantment with cemeteries. I don't expect my students to be delighted by the same things I am. Certainly, not all my students felt inspired by the cemetery visit. A few of them were complaining about their cold hands or were taking notes only dutifully. Their sense of wonder was stirred by different things: the number of small creatures in a tide pool, the diary of an 18th century school teacher, the intimacy of their friendships with one another. But there, in that cemetery, my sense of wonder was lit like a match. In cemeteries, I am reminded of the shimmering joy behind the practical and analytical aspects of history, that something ancient has, against all odds, endured. From the relatively Even the relatively ordinary has remained, has been marked and commemorated. Someone was loved and had a family that could afford a carved gravestone, and here is the proof of them. Even as a history teacher, even with all the persistent questions I still want answers to, I will never stop being amazed that we can know so much about everything that came before us. But my fixation on Noah Pratt Jr., the yeoman, Hogreave, father, husband, stonecutter, and petitioner of roads, is harder to explain. He was a relatively ordinary man. He and I have so little to connect us beyond the fact that I often drive on the same roads he rode and walked on. Even if he imagined that his work would be admired by passersby for generations, he couldn't have imagined that a group of students would kneel in front of his stones and take notes, would see a photocopied page of the census book he signed, or would consider why he made the artistic choices that he did. Surely he'd be surprised that someone, over 200 years after his death, would teach her students about him, would be preoccupied with gathering all the documents that bear his name, or would guess at his intentions and stylistic influences. But perhaps this essay is a fitting memorial for a man who memorialized so many people. If only so I can say, here lies the remaining evidence of Noah Pratt Jr.'s life, after his body has long since moldered into dust. And while I'm at it, let me remind you, my dearest reader, that the worms await you too. Oh, sorry.
So Lynn, if you want to go ahead and read for us.
Sorry, trying to get to the unmute button. So hi, I am Lynn. I am, as I said in my bio, I am the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, which carries a lot of weight with it. And I actually fully appreciate Rebecca reading ahead of me because it's a lot of research and it's a lot of trying to track down information and getting records and things like that, especially when your family doesn't always tell you the truth or when they died before they were able to tell you anything. So with that introduction, here we go. The first thing I remember my mother telling me as a child is that I would have survived the Holocaust, but my sisters would have been killed. Why? I'd asked. She would stroke my hair with a cigarette pressed between her lips. Your sisters, they have the dark hair. They would have been taken, she'd explain. But you have the blonde hair and the blue eyes the Germans looked for. I do not tell her that my eyes have always been green. Oversimplification. Someone said that it was easy, called the experience the Ritz, the camps, suggested that being torn from your home, given rags for clothes, hardened wood for shoes, forced to work while emaciated bodies dropped around you, breathing in ashed air was easy. For a time, because he is older, because he is a grandchild too, I believed that maybe it wasn't that bad. Then the documents are found. Camps are named. Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, Bremen, arrested at 18 and held for years, shipped against her will between camps, the forest screaming with the sunrise. My cousin has lived in our Babsha's house his entire life. I wonder if he says it was easy because she got away from the camps. And I wonder if he says it was easy because he can't figure out how to get out. By the time they are liberated, there is no fat left. Exhaustion is the emotion and ash the taste. It fills their mouths, their nostrils like being underwater. Knees jut like screwdrivers, elbows like knives, and rib bones are counted. By the time they are found, the survivors are bones with flesh clinging. When they sleep, you could mistake them for dead. They dug the graves. They hauled the bodies to the crematoriums. They tasted skin in the air. The only difference between the living and the dead here is which body can still show fear. So there is a lot of people who have ancestors who survived the concentration camps, who survived the Holocaust, who, because we've been told the stories our whole lives or in some fashion, we are very triggered by it. And so a lot of us like suffer from the residual PTSD of having the nightmares and things like that. And this actually gets talked about a lot within the circles of the grandchildren of survivors and things like that. And so this poem is kind of dedicated to that idea. And it's called Bloodline. I have had the nightmare, the one that does not belong to me, where they come. They shove my body, stacked shoulder to shoulder against strangers. Train station departure, train station arrival. They steal my clothes, inspect my body the way a blacksmith inspects his blade for imperfections. They are finding any reason to put me in the fire, remake my skin as ash. Some nights they find the cracks. Some nights I wake up screaming from a nightmare that belongs only to my blood. And the next poem I have is The Bones Beneath Us. As they dig into the earth to create a bed for a luxury condo, the workers' shovels collide with bone. They pause, excavating the torture, skulls shattered by bullets, body upon body upon body. Over 1,000 corpses lifted, unnamed, unidentified, unimportant. The work stops just long enough to declare this was a mass grave. The town officiant will say, we are all guilty. We all walk on bodies, and then continue construction. And I have 2 more poems. Is that okay? Yeah, okay, awesome. So the next poem I have is called Chocha. Family legend says she seduced a guard. Says she shot him with his own gun, says pregnancy and coat hanger and blood between legs. Family legend says that there was a choice and she chose to live. Arrest records confirm Ravensbrück. Research says all female imprisonment camp says broken and transplanted bones and sterilization, says homosexuality is outlawed. And to help curb those tendencies, brothel. Says your body is not your own, and if you feel sick, here is a gas chamber for your weary body. Research says that if you were arrested for performing abortions, you now force them on prisoners who were offered as a reward for the male prisoners who met their quotas. Life experience tells me that regardless of forced or chosen, I am more like my Chocha than I ever thought imaginable. Tells me when history repeats itself, I will be taken, labeled with whatever triangle they can find. Life experience tells me my mother was wrong. My hair would not save me now. When I walked into that clinic, I stopped being safe. And the last poem I have is called Survivor's Guilt. I joined a Facebook group for Holocaust survivors and descendants. People share photos of loved ones, the young and smooth skin of those who were murdered, the aged and frail hands of those who made it out. I take it in stride. There is only so much room in the human body for so much grief. A woman posts, asks for information on how to read the documents, and I tell her, her family and mine were at the same camp together. I apologize, because mine made it out. Thank you. Whew.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you both. It's hard to imagine more different treatments of our theme. I'm going to give Lynn a minute to settle and get our chat started with Rebecca.
And actually, before you get into the questions, we don't have questions coming in the chat yet, but I want to tell you both, and particularly Lynn, your last couple, there's lots of comments from our viewers just saying good job, speechless. They enjoyed both of the readings, so.
Go ahead and unmute yourselves, guys.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I will definitely look into that when we log off because I can't see it on my screen right now. So thank you, everyone.
So Rebecca, first, I want to thank you for including the phrase free roaming hogs I'm pretty sure I won't hear that in a reading again. But my question is about all the research that you referred to in your piece. I was once at an author talk. The author had written some nonfiction and also some fiction that was based on a lot of research. And he wound up talking about, how he got his ideas and built energy for his various books. And he tried to impress upon us that if there was any area of interest or any particular thing, a person or an event or anything that sort of we couldn't stop thinking about and we kept collecting information on, that was a signal that this was something that was feeding you creatively, and you needed to make space for it and focus on it and start finding out where it might take you. Take it to the page and find out where it might go. And so I'm wondering if all of your research and the collection of all that information you were talking about, and I think it was a longer piece, so there is more out there that you have, is that your one project? Is that your one creative project about Noah Pratt Jr. and gravestone carving and cemeteries, or do you have more in you, do you think?
It is my only one about Noah Pratt Jr. And I do think like that was the container that sort of creative energy needed. I think that sort of exhausted in some ways that like preoccupation, because I think like a part of that preoccupation was also like why I was so interested, which was kind of like a snaky in its tail situation. So I do think like that essay was what that sort of like preoccupation needed. It is actually my only piece about cemeteries, but I still do like a lot of cemetery research, and I'm always very interested in like local burying grounds, and sort of like I still love like reading different epitaphs and sort of like seeing those trends. But I haven't written anything. I don't know if maybe in the future I will, but so far that's my only cemetery piece.
Well, you mentioned ghost stories, that you really like ghost stories, so there's a link there. But I was just struck by, you said you almost, or maybe I was projecting, because I'll do this about certain things. If it felt like you were saying that you were almost obsessed with collecting information about this guy and his work for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, I bet you he emerges again, or I bet you build a character like him at some point. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I remember for my undergrad, I forget even exactly what the connection was, but we had a project that involved going to a cemetery. I just remember like being surprised by how suddenly introspective the experience was, like walking down those lines and just being there is such an experience. So I totally can see where a piece like this would come from, and that exploration and fascination.
I actually find cemeteries very comforting, and I'm not sure why, because I'm a pretty morbid person, and I don't feel comfortable thinking about death, especially my own. But for some reason, especially old cemeteries, when they're sort of overgrown and there are huge trees, there's a lot of beauty around, natural beauty. I just find it's almost like I feel, this sounds odd, but it's almost like I feel a kind of a vibration, coming up. Like I walk into that space and I feel connected somehow to sort of I don't know, that everything that was buried there, not just the people, but everything that they connected with, everything they cared about. For some reason, I sort of tap into that when I go into, especially an old cemetery, and I feel very, very comfortable there. And I always want to stay for a while.
Different cemeteries definitely have different energies for sure. And some you can feel that like, oh, this is very welcome and happy. And then like some of them are just like, I need to leave. This is the scariest place I've ever been, and it's daylight right now.
Wow. So I've never had that experience. I kind of like to. Yeah. Huh. What about you, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I've only been to a couple like by choice, and they've been like local main ones. So I don't have a wide range to pull from. Because that project, I think there were two in particular that I spent like significant time at. And those were more the kind of quiet, thoughtful ones. But it's funny, I can't remember the author or the title, so this is a very poor reference, but there's a prose poem that the image has stuck with me. That was all about the dash between two dates containing an entire life.
Yep.
Which is just, it's such a fascinating image, and it ties very closely to gravestones, where like you get an epitaph and a dash, and that is the entirety of a person's existence commemorated in stone.
Oof.
I
You know, this-
also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go
Zach.
ahead.
Oh,
No,
okay.
you go ahead.
So I also really appreciate Rebecca's like just research in general, and the fact that like taking a student group to the cemeteries. I just read an article earlier this week about how an 8th grade group in Massachusetts right now is actively working to exonerate one of the people who died in the Salem witch trials, and say like, this person should not be attached to this conviction, like this time period. It was insane. And so like they're actually like getting legalities involved because of a trip they took to a cemetery. So like, Rebecca, you're doing awesome work, and like you don't even know how you're going to affect your kids with doing that.
Yeah, my husband would be very satisfied by this conversation because he's an archivist. So anything, and he's on the board of a local cemetery, historic cemetery in Lewiston, Auburn. I'm not sure which. Actually, I can't remember. Yeah, I don't know. It's very interesting. Oh, I was just going to mention, you probably all know Spoon River Anthology. You know, you don't know that Spoon? Am I saying it wrong? Spoon River Anthology, right? Spoon River.
I've heard the name, but I'm not.
Oh my goodness. Look it up. It's fantastic. It's a collection of, I mean, people receive them as kind of as like little poems, but it's almost like this sort of floating conversation of all the people who have died in a town. And it's basically, it's sort of like little epitaphs of the, you just have to, it's been around forever. I can't remember when it was written. I want to say 50s or something like that. It's amazing. You need to read it. If you have an affinity for cemeteries, and thinking about legacy and those sort of, that it's just a wonderful, wonderful book to try. I'm so excited that you haven't heard of it, because now I'm the one bringing it to you. Trust me, you're going to love it.
I just opened up a window so I can look at it after this.
Okay. Oh, I hope I remembered the right thing. I'll take it in a minute. Or before we sign off, Lynn, I'll Google it, make sure I have the right thing.
Oh, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So Lynn, my question for you is about writing about such difficult things. I have done a little bit of memoir work, written a few personal essays about some really tough things. And I found that so grueling in a way that, writing fiction for me is healing for me. It opens me up. It connects me to the world. It makes me feel like I have purpose. When I was writing memoir pieces at the time, it felt like something I needed to do, and maybe I did. But man, it just drained me and threatened to break me. So to the point that I don't know if I'll ever go back to it. So it makes me wonder, how do you think about that? Like, how does it feel for you to be writing about such dark things in your family?
So I write about a lot of dark things. Like, I feel like I'm frequently known as the sad poet. I have like one happy poem for every like 100 really dark, sad poems that like exist. When it came to writing these poems that I shared tonight, my babcia had passed away in 2019, and I spent like 8 hours at her deathbed. And it was my first experience seeing death that close. It's not a good time. And again, just growing up with my mom always telling me like, you would have survived the Holocaust, but your sisters would have died. Like that's one of my first memories that I have. And it's always sat with me. So then to have my babcia pass and have all of these questions that I never got to answer, because by the time I met her, she was diagnosed with like Alzheimer's and dementia. So it was a good day if she remembered who I was, let alone being able to really like get her story and talk to her. And so after her passing, my very brilliant friend, I call her Mama P, she reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to look into your family history? Like, I know this is important to you. And so she actually got on ancestry.com and started finding the immigration records, finding the arrest records, finding just any pieces that we could. And so we were actually able to find a lot of information on my chocha and where she was held. And from there, doing the different levels of research. And so the Holocaust itself is horrific. I think like there's a certain feeling that comes over everyone when they hear the words concentration camp or Holocaust or World War II. Like everybody knows that feeling. And then it adds a layer to have your family be affected by it. And then it adds another layer to know that for the last 50 years, they didn't talk about it. So an example, I just reached out to one of my cousins to ask if my chocha knows why my babcha was arrested. I was like, all right, I'm just going to try to get it from the source, see if this happens. And my cousin asked my chocha directly, and she had a breakdown. She like started screaming at my cousin and was like, don't ask me these things. And then she was like, and then she left without eating dinner. And like for an elderly woman, not eating dinner is kind of a big deal. So when tackling these topics, and I would say this for any writer, one, brace yourself that you're gonna go through a series of depression. It's really hard looking at the pictures, doing the research, reading the articles, reading the essays and experiences, and listening to the firsthand accounts to be able to generate these types of pieces. And then also just make sure you're taking care of yourself in the meantime and let yourself feel these feelings. The Nazis did not have the capacity to recognize humanity, and that's how this happened. So let yourself be sad. And writing memoir is incredibly difficult, just like writing intense poems can be incredibly difficult. And I think did I answer the question? That's probably the best I can give.
In a way, it sounds to me like, you know, part of the reason that this is really good work for you is that you're sort of answering some questions for yourself. You're filling in some spaces. And that's kind of what I can do with my fiction. Whereas when I was trying to write the memoir, it was more about purging things that, you know, I just been carrying around for a really long time. So it sounds like a little bit of a different approach. But it makes me listening to you talk about it, it makes me be able to connect better with what drove you to the work, which is always really interesting. And I hope should be interesting and helpful for writers who are listening. So that's great. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. And of course, I'm sorry, but another title I have to throw in there. Unmute yourself, Rebecca, because you want to jump in right after I finish this comment. If you have not read, I think the title, and again, before we leave, I'll Google it, make sure I have it right. But if you have not read, I think it's called The Search for 6 and 6 Million by Daniel Mendelsohn.
I will look
I'm sorry.
I said I will look into that.
Okay, it's astonishing. It's a really, really long, beautifully written memoir about a man who he's a wonderful critic. I don't know if you've ever read him. He used to write pieces for New York Review of Books. He wanted to find out. He grew up in a family too who had come from Holocaust survivors, and he became aware as a child at some point that there were certain things that were not talked about in front of the kids. And there were just these big holes in their history. And then he got old enough to sort of understand why. And then he wanted to know more. And it turns out that a lot of his family was able to escape the Holocaust and come to America, but there was a little chunk of his family who could not. And there was like this one little branch, and it was like 6 of them, and they all died in the Holocaust, and they weren't sure where and how. So he wanted to sort of track down, you know, what had happened to them. And it's really a beautiful book. It's a painful book, but it's beautiful. So I highly recommend that. You just made me think of it when you were talking about your work.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Rebecca. Sure.
I was just like listening to you talk about your work. I think it's one of those questions about whether the research is sort of driving the writing project or whether the writing project is driving the research. And I think it's like especially complicated when it's research to your personal or family history. So do you think like you would have sought these answers without the writing project, or did it like embolden you? Or yeah.
That's a great question. So when I work on writing things, and when I finally say like, oh, I'm going to make this really big piece, like I'm going to make a collection or I'm going to write a book, I kind of sit with it for a while and then kind of look at what all I have. So by the time I finally sat down and said, like, I'm going to make a poetry collection, I already had a creative nonfiction piece published. I already had bits of a memoir about my Bobshell already written. And then I started looking at all these other pieces and I was like, no, like, I think that poetry is going to be the best way to do this right now. And part of it is because the poem that I read tonight, I believe it's called the Bones Beneath Us or the Bodies Beneath Us, about the luxury condo being built. I read this article, I think it was in 2017, about a luxury condo in like just outside of Poland being built, and they found a mass grave. And they're like, everybody was like, oh my God, like, we need to make this a sacred place. We need to make this a historical landmark. And the guy who ran the place was like, no, we're going to build a luxury condo here. And they just moved all of the bodies. Like, I don't even necessarily know if they did the testing to try to connect with families who might have survived, but it was thousands of bodies that were removed. And just the callousness of just building, like, that place is going to be haunted. There is no doubt in my mind. And this is like circling back to Claire and the cemeteries. Like, there are some places with really bad energy for a reason. Like, that condo should not be built.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Like, I think I'm similar to Claire, and I think that we've talked about this in past readings as well, that a lot of my fiction is kind of processing and trying to understand, but the nonfiction terrifies me. And like to be that vulnerable on the page, and really both of you tonight sharing such kind of personal, like it's putting yourself out there in a way that fiction, you can color it with 50 degrees of difference and channel it through a battle unicorn. And like all of a sudden you can tackle the same issues, but it's safer in some ways. So I have so much respect for people who can just kind of pour it out and tackle these things head on, in the way that both of you have, but Lynn in particular, to press into family questions like that and look for those answers.
Thank you.
And Kelly on Facebook does have a question for both of you. We've got a couple questions coming in, actually. So we'll start with Kelly, who's asking, when did both of you start writing? Where did this all begin?
Rebecca, I'll let you go answer first.
Yeah, that's a really hard question to answer. I mean, I've been like writing and making up stories pretty much my whole life. Pretty much my whole life, I guess I've always like loved making up stories and writing stories. I think maybe I started taking writing more seriously in college, although I didn't sort of like pursue it more professionally until I decided to go to graduate school. And mostly I write fiction. I actually didn't start writing nonfiction, and I write it very, very rarely until grad school.
And I think for me, very similarly, again, some of my first memories are like grabbing a piece of paper, writing a brilliant story, but I didn't know how to write and I didn't know how to read. And so I would be pissed and I would bring my work to my mom and I was like, I need you to teach me. Like, I want to remember these stories. They're so brilliant. They were not. But yeah, like as a kiddo, I would write The Adventures of Buttercup, which was a little pony that was born down the street and talking about like running away with this pony, even though I was terrified of horses. But so similarly, I did not start taking writing more seriously until like 2018. So 2017 was a devastating year for me. I lost my dog, which is what Dead Dog Poems is about, which actually is published next month. And the day before my dog died, one of my best friends also passed away. And then there was some family issues and just a ton of other stuff that happened in 2017. And so I needed somewhere for that to go. And then I was reading a lot of Rupi Kaur. And I was like, this is 3-line poetry. Like, I can write something profound. And so I started trying to kind of mimic that. And in 2018, I landed my first chapbook deal for Gravity. And pretty much since then, I was like, oh, somebody liked my writing. Maybe this isn't complete garbage. So that's when I started taking myself more seriously.
Yeah, it's funny how the question of when did you start writing sort of becomes, when did you start taking yourself seriously as a writer?
Yeah.
You know, when did you
Yeah.
decide to invest in your writing in that way?
Yeah, and I mean, so many writers I hear talk about we're always the dreamers and the storytellers, but I think everyone's got that moment where we all like stepped back and realized like there's something here, like I can do this, and it always grows from that moment.
Yeah, I feel like for a lot of us, that moment that like something is here. Like, I remember in 7th and 8th grade, my teacher, Mrs. Watchhorn, like pulling me to the side after like an essay assignment, and she was like, this is really good. Like, this is really good. Like, this is really well done. Do you want extra credit? Because I want you to write another story. And I was like, yeah, I could use an A. That would be good. And it's amazing to look back at how many people influence those tiny things to keep you writing, even though you go on a different path and study different things in school. Like, I got my undergraduate degree in medical biology. I am not doing anything with it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
bless the teachers who encouraged us, and may the ones who set us back have, I don't know, an upset stomach tonight. That's enough.
Yeah, no, I remember my kind of kickoff was a teacher as well, so 7th grade creative writing. And that was the moment I realized like I can do something with this, and like I actually enjoy it. So Rebecca, more power to you for being a teacher and being able to have that impact, even if it doesn't manifest until years later.
Absolutely. Teachers are so important.
Yeah, to plant that seed, and who knows what it's going to become.
And you have to just assume that it's going to have that effect, whether they come back and tell you or not, because trust me, there are many I've never come back to and told, but that I remember is important. So
I got to friend Mrs. Watchhorn on Facebook, and I sent her a message, and I was just like, you changed my life, and I'm so grateful to you.
the
So
age of social media.
Yeah, I don't know if she'll watch this, but shout outs.
So Gary is in our comments as well, and Gary is a photographer in Lewis and Auburn. In person documents all of our events. So Gary, thanks for being here. But he's asking for both of you, does writing about historical connections regarding death help you feel connection and understanding, or does it bring more questions? And Rebecca, do you mind starting? And
yeah, that's a great question. And I think like in some ways both. But I do think like, especially when I write, well, I guess also fiction, I was gonna say especially nonfiction, but I do think I do get some like answers, maybe not sort of clear cut answers, but I do think writing helps me figure out how I feel about things, and also like why a lot of times I start writing about something because I'm interested in it, but part of the project is figuring out like, why am I interested in this? Like, what is it about this that is pulling me towards it? And I think with the essay I read from, that certainly was happening, and sort of this processing of like, I think there's so much with cemeteries that sort of I find intriguing, but I really think it is sort of this idea of like cultural legacy. And then also this realization that a lot of it had to do with like, just this idea of preservation, like the fact that, like in, maybe it's morbid to think, all you have is a gravestone, like that so much of us is lost. But to me, it's like that there is even this proof of just a person still there is pretty remarkable. So I do think I'm there for answers. And if the essay turns out that I'm getting the answers. Yeah.
So one of the things that I really liked about Rebecca's piece was the ending of like, even the worms are coming for you too. In high school, I had a lot of very close friends die within a year span. I've actually been diagnosed with PTSD as a result of that, because you lose so many close deaths, and it really like messes with your brain function. So I've been really connected to a lot of really like messed up things and morbid things. So an example, the Oklahoma City bombing happened on my birthday. Columbine happened the day after my birthday, and then also Hitler's birthday is the day after my birthday, and the shot heard around the world was on my birthday. And so I've always felt these really powerful connections to these really important moments in history. And I've always kind of looked at things in a little more intensely. So I'm a social worker, which means that I take on a lot of people's trauma and I have to digest it myself, which means that for my writing, it also gives me an ability to be able to look at things like death reports and autopsy reports and, you know, testimonies from Holocaust survivors and things like that. At the same time, I was working on my Babcha collection. I was working on another collection called Love Your Gun, which looked at the mass shootings in the US, which looked at Sandy Hook and Virginia Tech and Columbine and so many of the others. There's so many at this point. And I spent a lot of time looking at the autopsy reports and looking at the path the bullet takes and looking at, you know, just like some of the caskets and things like that. Some people took some images, and really allowing myself to feel those feelings and recognize how fragile life is. And that's where I really liked Rebecca's piece, saying like the worms will come for you too, and we have no control over that. And so circling back to like, we just have our little dash, and it's what we do with it that's so important. And so yeah.
Just to add to that, in response to what Gary was asking, I've said it so many times, and I'll say it again because it just comes up all the time when we talk about writing. And I think it's something that we writers have to sort of relearn over and over and over again. And it's that you don't figure out what you want to write and then sit down and write it. You write so that you figure out what you want to say.
Yeah.
You know, that's how you figure out what you think and what you want to say about it. It's the process of writing that gets you there.
Yeah.
If you try it the other way around, you're going to keep hitting a wall.
Yeah, no, I've had so many pieces where I get halfway, 3/4 through, and then all of a sudden I realize like, oh, like this is about something. And it's nearly done sometimes by the time I realized like what was driving it from the beginning, but I was not necessarily aware of this thing that I was circling the whole time. And I mean that's what art is. I think it's so often we're just trying to understand stuff. We're trying to put words to things that can't be described, and we're doing the best we can to do it. And even Rebecca in particular, that whole idea of memorializing things, like the art tells the stories that would otherwise be forgotten. So
yeah, and it's also all you writers out there, it's why if you really have to learn to love revision, because you know, you've got to do a lot of writing to figure out what you want to do, what you're saying. And then you go back and you do the work of crafting it all and shaping it all around what you've discovered in your writing. It's always makes me sad when people say they hate revision, because I'm like, oh, that's gonna, you're going to have some tough days if you hate revision.
I will learn to love it someday.
I have a wonderful editor. His name is Alex Ruiz, and on more than one occasion, he has made me cry with his edits because he's very direct with it. Hi, Enyo. And he's not afraid to like blatantly be like, this is garbage, delete this. Like, I don't know what you're doing here. And I appreciate it so much, but revision is one of the hardest things for me, very, very genuinely.
Well, I can't say that's the language I would use, but I'm glad that works for you. That's all I'll have to say about that.
Yeah, no, it's right. I learned in grad school that when I get revision feedback, most of the time I need at least 24 hours. Just sit with it. And like, I can't even touch the story because I feel it. And then like a couple days go by, I'm like, okay, like they have a point. And like, I can admit that. But yeah, that first thing, it's tough to deal with sometimes, but it always does make it better.
Mhm.
I gobble that stuff up. I've never had any trouble with it, but the I think that the one like superpower I have as a writer is that I am very comfortable taking on board what I see, is right and can help me. And I have no trouble whatsoever just going, no, don't think so. And ignoring what I don't think helps me at all. And I just stay the course and move right through it and don't feel buffeted by it at all. That's my one superpower. And I don't actually know too many writers who have that superpower. So I'm really happy about it.
What about you, Rebecca? How does editing go for you?
I mean, I like the revision process more than the begin. I think I hate the beginning process. I like revising. There's something there. Usually, like I like shape. It's like you get to shape it. And also, like I really like getting feedback. I think.
So you have that superpower too. Yay.
I also think like as a teacher, I give so much revision. I think it's easier to understand that revision comes from a place of like attention and love. When people give you feedback, it's because they see something in your writing.
Yeah, and similarly, with Josh's, I step away for 24 hours. I also do that. And 99% of the time, the edits that I get back, even the ones that are like, this is garbage, delete this, like they're 100% right. It's just that like I have this image in my head of like I'm so perfect and I write all these great things, but like revision really does help strengthen all of the pieces, and I'm grateful for it, but I hate it.
Somebody once told me that you don't have to take revision advice, but if you are getting it, but it means something's off. You don't have to do what they're saying, but you have to acknowledge that it's not doing, like something's getting lost along the way.
I don't think that's always true, but I think that's very often true. But
trust the person who's giving a revision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very often true. You have to really open yourself up so that you can hear something's off, because you might be blinded by the fact that the person is giving you terrible advice. You don't have to take the advice, but what you can hear is that, okay, they're not reading it the way that I wanted them to. And so I can take that on board and figure out why that's happening. Yeah, that's definitely happened to me. You have to be open to that.
Yeah, no, I think it was Neil Gaiman who said, if someone tells you there's a problem, they're probably right. But if they tell you how to fix it, they're probably wrong.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is there's certainly exceptions, but I feel like that's a good kind of core idea to hold on to for feedback and revision.
I have never heard that before, and I love it.
We are right at 7. I'm sure we could keep talking about writing stuff all night, but the last comment I'll pull from Facebook, Kelly is saying, "What a cute pup." So I'm sure Enyo's appearance is appreciated.
Well, and we have to. Yes, I was going to say we have to put a word out for Rebecca's kitty cat, because that was wonderful. Before we go, let me just tell you, because I took a minute to look them up. I did nail it for Spoon River Anthology. Yes. I got the date wrong. It was 1915, actually. And it's a collection of short free verse poems that narrate the epitaphs of the residents of this town by Edgar Lee Masters. And then the other one was The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million. It's a memoir by Daniel Mendelsohn, and I highly recommend both if you have not had them come across your desk before.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome. What a great reading. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Lynn and Rebecca, thank you. And thank you to everyone who tuned in, either live or anyone who comes back to this after the fact. It'll be up on Facebook and YouTube. Yeah, I mean, just thank you for supporting Maine writers. We love having an audience. We love being able to share this work. And it's always so great to hear how it impacts people. So we will be back at 3 o'clock Eastern time tomorrow with 3 more writers talking about this theme. And we're excited to hear what they have to say. So tune in if you're able, or check it out afterwards if you're not around at that time period. But thanks for listening, and we will be back. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.